The Glass Harmonica's Fatal Frequency, a Velvet Clues production narrated by Connor. Welcome, dear listeners, to Velvet Clues. I'm Connor, and tonight I have the distinct pleasure of bringing you a most peculiar tale involving an instrument of sublime beauty, a concert that ended in tragedy, and the keen observations of a certain Miss Jane Marple, whose quiet wisdom has a way of illuminating the darkest corners of human deception. As you settle in with your favourite beverage, I invite you to join me in unravelling the mystery of the Glass Harmonica's Fatal Frequency. Chapter 1. The Prelude to Catastrophe. The autumn evening had arrived at Thornbury Hall with the sort of theatrical precision that seemed almost orchestrated by some invisible conductor of the seasons. Miss Jane Marple stood in the grand foyer, her gloved hands folded neatly before her, observing with quiet interest the peculiar collection of guests who had gathered for what promised to be one of the most extraordinary musical events the village had witnessed in living memory. A concert featuring the glass harmonica, that delicate and rarely performed instrument invented by Benjamin Franklin himself, had drawn the attention of collectors, musicians, and music enthusiasts from across 3 counties. The glass harmonica, for those unfamiliar with its existence, is a most unusual creation, consisting of a series of glass bowls of different sizes, arranged in order of pitch and mounted on a spindle. When water-wetted fingers are drawn across the rims of these bowls, they produce sounds of ethereal beauty, tones so pure and otherworldly that some claim the instrument possesses almost supernatural qualities. This evening, the renowned virtuoso Marcus Winterby was to perform a concert celebrating the instrument's remarkable history and Franklin's enduring legacy. Miss Marple had not come to Thornbury Hall specifically to hear the concert, though she had accepted the invitation with her characteristic grace. Rather, she had been requested by the hall's owner, Lord Ashford, to spend the weekend as a guest, ostensibly to lend her presence to what he considered a most important social occasion. That Miss Marple possessed other reasons for accepting remained, as always, her private affair. The concert hall at Thornbury had been prepared with considerable care. The stage held not 1 but 2 glass harmonicas. This is due, positioned prominently beneath carefully positioned lighting that seemed designed to showcase their crystalline perfection. An elderly gentleman approached Miss Marple as she surveyed the scene, introducing himself as Professor Harold Thorne, a musicologist and historian of considerable reputation. "Remarkable instruments, aren't they?" the professor remarked, gesturing toward the stage. "Though I confess that modern reproductions can never quite capture the soul of an authentic Franklin-era harmonica. The glass composition, the dimensional precision, the very history imbued in the original bowls, all of these elements contribute to a quality that contemporary craftsmen struggle to replicate." Miss Marple turned her attention to the professor with the sort of patient interest she habitually extended to those who possessed genuine expertise in any field. "You seem remarkably knowledgeable about these instruments, Professor. Have you devoted considerable study to them?" "Indeed, I have," Thorne replied, warming to the subject with the enthusiasm of an academic finding a willing listener. "In fact, I've spent the better part of 2 decades studying the harmonica and its properties. I've examined original instruments, analysed their acoustic characteristics, and even conducted experiments on the frequencies they produce. It's a passion that consumes much of my time." Before Miss Marple could respond, a commotion near the stage drew their attention. Marcus Winterby had arrived, a striking figure with shoulder-length hair and an air of theatrical confidence that seemed to precede him like an invisible herald. He examined both instruments with an intensity that suggested a musician of genuine dedication to his craft. A woman approached Miss Marple as she continued observing the preparations. She introduced herself as Catherine Wells, the concert's organiser and a collector of antique instruments. Catherine appeared to be a woman of perhaps 50 years, with sharp eyes that missed little and a manner that suggested considerable intelligence beneath a superficially pleasant exterior. "Miss Marple," Catherine said warmly, "I'm delighted that Lord Ashford persuaded you to attend. Your presence lends such distinction to our gathering." I do hope you will enjoy the concert. Marcus is quite extraordinary with the harmonica. Tonight's performance should be something truly memorable." Miss Marple noted with interest that Catherine's gaze lingered on Marcus with an intensity that seemed to go beyond simple professional appreciation. There was something in her expression, a flicker of something more complex that suggested deeper layers beneath the surface of their interaction. The orchestra began their preparations. The concert hall filled gradually with guests who took their seats with the sort of anticipatory excitement that precedes any unusual entertainment. Miss Marple found herself positioned where she could observe both the stage and the audience, a vantage point that would prove to have its own peculiar significance as the evening progressed. As the concert began, Sir Marcus approached the primary harmonica with a reverence that seemed genuinely felt. The first notes emerged, ethereal and pure, filling the hall with those characteristic tones that made the glass harmonica so distinctive and so unsettling to many who heard it. The music was beautiful, undeniably so, yet Miss Marple found herself studying the faces of those around her as much as attending to the performance. Professor Thorne listened with evident pleasure, nodding occasionally as though recognising particular passages or techniques. Catherine Wells watched with an intensity that seemed to border on anxiety, her hands gripping the armrest of her chair with what appeared to be considerable tension. Other members of the audience seemed lost in the music, transported by the unusual beauty of the tones. The performance continued for perhaps 20 minutes, moving through a programme of traditional pieces composed specifically for the harmonica in the 18th and 19th centuries. Marcus's technical mastery was evident in every gesture, every subtle shift in his position that altered the angle of his fingers against the spinning glass bowls. Then, approximately halfway through a particularly complex passage, something began to change. Marcus's movements, which had been fluid and precise, became jerky and uncertain. His expression shifted from the focused concentration of performance to something more distressed. The notes, which had been so carefully controlled, began to become discordant, dissonant, jarring to the ear in a way that seemed to violate the very nature of the instrument. A murmur passed through the audience, a collective sensing that something had gone profoundly wrong. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her keen eyes observing every detail of what was transpiring. Marcus appeared to be struggling, his body beginning to convulse in what looked like some sort of medical event. He gripped the edge of the harmonica's frame, his knuckles whitening under the force of his grip. "Someone call a physician," Lord Ashford shouted, rising from his seat. But even as the words left his mouth, Marcus Winterby stumbled backward, his body rigid, and then collapsed entirely onto the stage. His eyes rolled back, foam appearing at the corner of his mouth, and within moments the virtuoso who had been producing such ethereal music lay motionless on the polished boards. The concert hall erupted into chaos. Women cried out, "Barbiwa!" Guests stood and pressed toward the stage seeking to help or simply to see what had occurred. Miss Marple remained seated, observing the scene with the calm detachment that had served her well through the years, her mind already beginning to sort through the peculiar elements of what she had witnessed. By the time a local physician, Dr. Brennan, had pushed through the crowd and reached Marcus, it was clear that any attempt at resuscitation would be futile. The young musician was quite dead, his body already cooling, his magnificent talent extinguished as suddenly as a candle in the wind. As constables arrived and began establishing order, Miss Marple found her attention drawn to the glass harmonicas themselves, particularly to that one Marcus had been playing. There was something about the arrangement of the bowls, some subtle detail about the positioning or perhaps the glass itself, that seemed to arrest her attention in a way she could not quite immediately articulate. She resolved that she would examine the instruments more carefully when circumstances permitted such scrutiny. For the present, however, the evening had descended from concert to crime scene, from music to mystery, and Miss Marple settled herself to observe how the various threads of this tragic event would begin to unravel. Chapter 2. Frequencies and Fabrications. The morning following Marcus Winterby's death arrived grey and rather uninviting, the sort of day that seemed to match the mood of all those connected with the tragic events of the previous evening. Miss Marple had spent a restless night. No, her mind turning over the various peculiarities of the concert and its catastrophic conclusion. She had witnessed many forms of death in her long life, but the specific circumstances of Marcus's collapse held elements that troubled her in ways she'd not yet fully articulated. Inspector Devereux, a capable if somewhat conventional investigator from the county constabulary, had taken charge of the inquiry. His initial inclination was to treat the matter as a straightforward medical emergency, a tragic but ultimately natural death, perhaps precipitated by an existing heart condition or some similar physiological weakness. It was Professor Harold Thorne who first introduced the element that would transform the investigation. He requested an audience with the inspector early in the morning, and Miss Marple happened to be present in Lord Ashford's study when the professor arrived, his normally calm demeanour evidently disturbed. "Inspector," Thorne began without preamble, "I believe you may have overlooked a crucial element in your preliminary investigation. The glass harmonica that Marcus was playing last evening produces frequencies that are, in my studied opinion, potentially dangerous to human health." Inspector Devereux looked sceptical. "Dangerous frequencies, Professor? I'm not certain I follow your meaning. The instrument is essentially just water and glass. Surely there's nothing inherently hazardous about such materials." "Taken individually, no," Thorne agreed, adjusting his spectacles with the precision of an academic accustomed to precise speech. "However, when combined in the specific configuration of the glass harmonica, and when played in particular ways, the instrument can produce resonance frequencies that may have profound effects on the human nervous system. I have spent years studying the harmonica's acoustic properties, and I have documented evidence that certain frequency combinations can induce neurological stress in listeners and performers alike." Miss Marple, who had been occupied with her needlework, paused to give the professor her complete attention. "You suggest, Professor, that Marcus Winterby might have been somehow harmed by the very instrument he was playing?" "I suggest precisely that, Miss Marple," Thorne replied, turning toward her with evident relief at finding someone who grasped the significance of his concern. "The frequencies produced by a glass harmonica, when the instrument is tuned to specific resonance patterns, can potentially trigger seizures, neurological events, even in individuals with no previous history of such conditions. The water within the bowls amplifies certain harmonics, creating vibrations that can propagate through the air and directly affect the brain tissue of anyone in close proximity." Inspector Devereux remained unconvinced. "You're suggesting that musical frequencies caused a fatal seizure? That seems rather far-fetched, Professor. There must be a simpler explanation. A pre-existing condition perhaps, or some form of poison, though preliminary examination revealed no obvious toxins in the deceased's system." "Then perhaps," Miss Marple suggested gently, "we might examine the instrument itself more closely. Professor Thorne's expertise might prove invaluable in determining whether the harmonica had been altered or modified in some manner that might have rendered it capable of producing frequencies beyond its normal range." This suggestion seemed to strike Inspector Devereux as reasonable, and shortly thereafter, the glass harmonica that Marcus had been playing was secured and transported to a facility where more detailed examination could be conducted. Professor Thorne supervised this process with meticulous care, documenting every measurement and acoustic test with the precision of a true scientist. It was during this examination that the first crucial discovery emerged. The bowls of the instrument, when measured with precise instruments, showed evidence of having been carefully modified. The glass had been etched in subtle patterns that were not part of the instrument's original design. These etchings, when analysed by Professor Thorne, appeared to create acoustic focusing properties, concentrating certain frequencies into a tight beam of sound that would have been directed precisely toward the player's head. "Someone has deliberately engineered this harmonica to produce harmful frequencies," Thorne announced, his voice carrying a mixture of scientific excitement and moral outrage. The modifications are subtle enough to be invisible to casual inspection, but their effect would be to amplify specific resonance frequencies to levels that could indeed trigger a seizure in a susceptible individual, or potentially cause more serious neurological damage. Inspector Devereux's scepticism finally began to waver. Then, we must consider the possibility that Marcus Winterby's death was deliberately caused by someone who had access to the instrument and the knowledge to modify it in such a manner. The question becomes, who possessed both that knowledge and the motive? It was at this juncture that Miss Marple made another observation. She had been examining the concert's programme notes, and she had noticed something peculiar about the second-class harmonica that had been positioned on stage but never played. "Inspector," she said, her tone reflective, "I wonder whether we might conduct a similar examination of the second harmonica. If one instrument was deliberately modified to produce harmful frequencies, might not the other have been similarly altered? Or perhaps modified in a different manner entirely?" This suggestion proved to be remarkably prescient. When the second instrument was examined, it appeared completely normal, its acoustic properties entirely within the expected range for a properly functioning glass harmonica. Yet what was remarkable about this discovery was not what the instrument revealed, but rather what its examination prompted. Catherine Wells, the concert's organiser, had been questioned regarding the provenance of both harmonicas. She had claimed that both instruments were 18th century originals, authentic examples of Benjamin Franklin's own design, items of considerable historical and monetary value. However, when her claims were cross-referenced with records maintained by the British Museum and several other institutional collectors, a troubling discrepancy emerged. The second harmonica, the one that had not been played, appeared to match all the specifications of an authentic period instrument. But the first harmonica, the one Marcus had played, showed modifications and characteristics that suggested it was actually a far more modern creation, an excellent reproduction certainly, but a replica nonetheless. This discovery opened an entirely new avenue of investigation, one that suggested deception on a scale far larger than merely rigging an instrument to produce harmful frequencies. The question of why Catherine Wells had misrepresented the provenance of the instruments became as important as determining who had modified the harmonica to produce lethal frequencies. Chapter 3. The Historian's Secret. The revelation that at least one of the supposedly authentic harmonicas was actually a modern replica cast the investigation into an entirely new light. Miss Marple found herself deeply invested in understanding the complex web of deception that seemed to underlie the entire concert. She requested permission from Inspector Devereux to conduct some private inquiries, a request that the inspector, perhaps recognising the value of her past assistance, was willing to grant. Her first step was to arrange a private conversation with Professor Harold Thorne. She invited him to take tea with her in Lord Ashford's library, a room lined with books and possessing a quiet solemnity that seemed appropriate for serious discussion. "Professor Thorne," Miss Marple began, once they were settled with their tea, "your knowledge of the glass harmonica appears to be extraordinarily comprehensive. Your measurements and acoustic analyses have been remarkably precise. I wonder whether you might have spent considerable time experimenting with the instrument's resonance properties." Thorne seemed to recognise where her questioning was leading. He set down his teacup with visible care, as though giving himself a moment to consider his response. "Miss Marple," he said slowly, "I must confess that my relationship with the glass harmonica extends beyond mere academic study. Yes, I have conducted experiments. Yes, I have calculated the theoretical frequencies that might produce neurological effects. In fact, I've documented such effects in considerable detail in my private research files. But I assure you, sir, those experiments were conducted purely for academic purposes, to advance the scientific understanding of the instrument's properties." "I do not doubt your academic intentions, Professor," Miss Marple replied gently. "However, I wonder whether someone else might have been aware of your research. The modifications to the harmonica that Marcus played are extremely sophisticated, suggesting knowledge of precise acoustic principles that only a specialist would possess. Your published work on harmonica frequencies is quite limited, Yet you mention maintaining comprehensive research files. Has anyone had access to those files?" Thorn appeared to age before her eyes. His hands trembled slightly as he lifted his teacup, set it down without drinking, and finally seemed to collapse into confession. "Catherine Wells," he said quietly. "Catherine came to me approximately 6 months ago claiming to be a serious collector of early musical instruments. She expressed interest in my research, suggested that we might collaborate on a comprehensive study of the harmonica's acoustic properties. I was flattered by her attention, I confess. She is a brilliant woman, Miss Marple, with a quick mind and genuine enthusiasm for the subject matter." "And you permitted her to examine your research files," Miss Marple stated quietly. "I did more than that," Thorn continued, his voice heavy with regret. "I invited her to my home laboratory. I showed her my calculations, demonstrated my apparatus, explained the precise frequencies that might produce resonance effects on human brain tissue. I was so pleased to have found someone who understood the nuances of the work, who could discuss the theoretical implications intelligently. I never imagined she might use that knowledge for any purpose other than academic advancement." "Yet she clearly did use that knowledge for another purpose," Miss Marple observed. "The modifications to the harmonica represent an application of your theoretical work, transformed from academic inquiry into something far more sinister. Tell me, Professor, when did you last see the harmonica before the concert?" "Catherine brought it to Thornbury Hall 2 days before the concert," Thorn recalled. "She had it in its protective case, and she displayed it to me with considerable pride, claiming it had just arrived from a private collector in France. She said the second harmonica was already here, no, that she'd been maintaining both instruments in separate locations until the evening of the concert, when they would be presented together as a culmination of her collector's aspirations." "Did you examine the harmonica when Catherine showed it to you?" Miss Marple pressed. "Only briefly," Thorn admitted. "Catherine seemed anxious about the instrument, said she was concerned about its condition after transport, asked me to merely observe rather than handle it. I viewed it in its case, noted that it appeared to be in excellent condition, and then she had it removed to a secure storage area pending the concert." Miss Marple absorbed this information with her characteristic gravity. The timeline was becoming clearer, the pattern of deception more apparent, yet certain elements remained obscure, certain motivations not yet fully illuminated. "Professor," she said after a moment, "I must ask you a rather direct question. Did you harbour any feelings of romantic attachment toward Catherine Wells?" Thorn's face reddened considerably. "Miss Marple, that is an extraordinarily intimate question. I would prefer not to answer it. Nevertheless, I believe the answer is crucial to understanding the full scope of what has transpired," Miss Marple continued with unrelenting gentleness. "Catherine Wells is a woman of considerable intelligence and charm. She has carefully cultivated a relationship with you, designed to gain access to your research. She has used that research to modify an instrument in such a way that it became capable of producing lethal frequencies. Now, the question becomes whether you might have been aware of her intentions and permitted it to occur, or whether you were manipulated by her charms into revealing information that she then used without your knowledge or consent." "The latter," Thorn said flatly. "I swear to you, Miss Marple, I had no knowledge of her intentions. When I learned that Marcus had died, that the harmonica had been deliberately modified, I was devastated. I attempted to contact Catherine immediately, but she cannot be found. She left the hall after the concert and has not been seen since." "And what was her relationship with Marcus Winterby?" Miss Marple asked. "They were professional colleagues," Thorn replied. "Marcus had been engaged to perform for the concert on Catherine's invitation. He was impressed by the quality of the instruments, excited about the opportunity to play an authentic Franklin-era harmonica. Catherine had described the instruments to him with considerable enthusiasm, claimed they were the jewels of her collection. Yet one was a replica, and the other had been deliberately modified to produce frequencies that would trigger a fatal seizure in anyone playing it," Miss Marple said quietly. "Tell me, Professor, did Marcus have any medical history that you were aware of? Any condition that might make him particularly susceptible to neurological events? Not that I'm aware of, Thorn said. He seemed to be a healthy young man in the prime of his career, though now that I consider it, I recall Catherine mentioning that Marcus had suffered from occasional migraines. She seemed quite concerned about them. Suggested that the emotional intensity of the concert might exacerbate such conditions. I thought her concern was touching, a sign of her care for his well-being. Perhaps it was, Miss Marple mused. Or perhaps it was calculation masquerading as concern, a recognition of a pre-existing vulnerability that could be exploited. A man prone to migraines might be particularly susceptible to the effects of specific resonance frequencies, might he not? I believe that to be true, Thorn acknowledged miserably, which means Catherine had already identified Marcus as vulnerable before the concert even began. She orchestrated his death with deliberate precision, using my research and my own emotional attachment to her as the means to accomplish it. Chapter 4. The Replica's Tale. The discovery that Catherine Wells had apparently orchestrated Marcus Winterby's death opened new questions that demanded investigation. Inspector Devereux, now convinced that the case involved murder rather than natural death, initiated a broader inquiry into Catherine's background and activities. Miss Marple, recognising certain patterns in the case that seemed to extend beyond mere criminal homicide, requested access to the concert hall and its contents before they were dispersed. She spent an afternoon examining the stage and the instruments with meticulous care, paying particular attention to the harmonica that had not been played. This instrument, according to Catherine's claims, was an authentic 18th century piece of considerable value. Yet Miss Marple found herself noticing details that seemed inconsistent with such provenance. The glass appeared too perfect, lacking the minor imperfections and subtle discolorations that time and use would typically impart. The wooden frame showed no evidence of the worm damage or wood movement that would normally appear in instruments of genuine age. Even the water seals and structural elements appeared too precisely engineered, too modern in their construction. She consulted once more with Professor Thorn, who confirmed her suspicions. "This harmonica is indeed a replica," he pronounced after careful examination. "Quite an excellent one, I might add, but definitely a modern creation. The glass composition, while similar to period glass, shows trace elements that are inconsistent with 18th century production methods. The wooden frame, though aged to appear older, contains wood that has not been exposed to sufficient time and weathering." "Then both instruments were replicas," Miss Marple observed. "Catherine claimed to possess authentic Benjamin Franklin harmonicas, when in fact she possessed only modern reproductions. But why would she do that?" Thorn wondered aloud. If she was simply engaged in deception for profit, there would be easier ways to perpetrate fraud. Why involve Marcus in the concert? Why risk such elaborate schemes? "That is indeed the crucial question," Miss Marple agreed. "Inspector Devereux, I wonder whether we might examine Catherine's financial records and business activities. I suspect that fraud on a considerable scale may be underlying this entire affair." The inspector, who'd come to rely on Miss Marple's insights, now authorised a thorough investigation of Catherine's background. What emerged was a picture of systematic deception conducted on a remarkable scale. Over the course of several years, Catherine Wells had been engaged in the business of selling authenticated historical musical instruments to wealthy collectors across Europe and America. Her method was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its scope. She would acquire excellent modern reproductions of historical instruments from a skilled craftsman in Amsterdam. She would then create elaborate documentation claiming these pieces were authentic period originals, complete with forged certificates of authenticity, fabricated provenance histories, and even commissioned academic papers from apparent experts authenticating the instruments. Nay, collectors would purchase these pieces for enormous sums, believing they were acquiring authentic examples of historical craftsmanship. In many cases, the victims never discovered the deception, contentedly displaying their authentic instruments in private collections or lending them to museums, all while Catherine moved on to her next fraud. "It's a remarkably sophisticated operation," Inspector Devereux observed as he reviewed the documentation. "She's defrauded collectors of hundreds of thousands of pounds over a period of years. But why would she risk such a profitable arrangement by orchestrating a murder?" "Because her fraud was beginning to unravel," Miss Marple explained. "Consider the timeline. Marcus Winterby was an accomplished musician with genuine expertise in the glass harmonica. He was selected by Catherine to perform at the concert precisely because his reputation would lend authenticity to her claims about the instruments. However, once Marcus began to work with the harmonicas, examining them closely, testing their acoustic properties, he would have quickly discovered that at least one of them, if not both, were replicas rather than authentic pieces." Professor Thorne nodded slowly as the logic became apparent. Catherine could not allow Marcus to expose the instruments as fakes. Not only would it destroy her reputation as a collector, but it would call into question every instrument she had sold, unravelling the entire fraud. "Precisely," Miss Marple confirmed. And so Catherine began to construct an alternative narrative. She would eliminate Marcus, using the very knowledge she had extracted from Professor Thorne's research. She would modify one of the replica harmonicas to produce lethal frequencies, orchestrate a concert where Marcus would be the performer, and construct a scenario that could plausibly be attributed to medical misadventure rather than murder. "But why claim the instruments were authentic in the first place?" Inspector Devereux asked. "If she intended to murder Marcus anyway, why not simply cancel the concert?" "Because Catherine required a context in which his death would seem almost inevitable," Miss Marple explained. "A concert featuring rare musical instruments creates an air of danger, exoticism, otherness. The glass harmonica in particular has a reputation, deserved or not, for producing disquieting effects on listeners. Catherine could count on public fascination with the instruments, on the assumption that something about the harmonica itself might have caused Marcus's death. An accident, a tragic consequence of playing a rare and temperamental instrument, not a deliberate murder." "Quite ingenious," Professor Thorne said sadly. "And it would have worked had I not recognised that the frequencies were being artificially induced. Had I attributed Marcus's death to natural causes or to some inherent property of the harmonica itself, Catherine might have escaped entirely." "She might have," Miss Marple agreed. "However, I suspect that Catherine's schemes were already beginning to unravel quite independently of the concert. Collectors are, as a general rule, meticulous individuals who develop expertise in their chosen field. The more time that passes after a purchase, the greater the likelihood that someone will discover the fraud." Catherine was accelerating her timeline, transforming a slow-moving fraud into something far more desperate and violent. The investigation that followed revealed Catherine's trail, leading through 3 countries and across a network of wealthy collectors and unscrupulous dealers. Inspector Devereux's colleagues located her attempting to flee to South America, travelling under an assumed name and carrying documentation for a new identity. Chapter 5. The Harmonica Speaks Truth. In the weeks following Catherine Wells's arrest, a more complete picture of her activities emerged through careful investigation and the examination of her private correspondence. Miss Marple found herself drawn into the inquiry with increasing intensity, sensing that certain aspects of the case had not yet been fully illuminated. She requested a final consultation with Professor Thorne regarding the modified harmonica. Together, they examined the instrument in a secure location, with Inspector Devereux present to oversee the proceedings. "Professor," Miss Marple began, "I wonder whether you might demonstrate exactly how the modifications to this harmonica would have produced the lethal frequencies. The technical aspects of acoustic engineering are not within my expertise, but I believe a clear demonstration might illuminate the final pieces of this puzzle." Thorne, who had seemed to find some redemption in assisting the investigation, was willing to oblige. Using specialized equipment, he mapped the frequency patterns that the modified harmonica would produce when played in the manner Marcus had performed. What emerged was a graphic representation of resonance waves, perfectly calibrated to interact with the human brain in a specific and destructive manner. The modifications that Catherine had commissioned created a focusing effect that would direct precisely calculated frequencies directly into the performer's brain tissue, creating waves that would interfere with normal neurological function. The frequencies are calculated to a precision of 0.1 Hz, Thorne explained, his voice heavy with the implications of what he was describing. That level of precision suggests months of careful engineering and testing. Catherine must have worked with a highly skilled acoustic engineer to achieve this result. Yet no such engineer has been discovered, Inspector Devereux observed. Our inquiries have been unable to locate anyone matching the description of someone who might have conducted such work. Because Catherine did not work with an external engineer, Miss Marple said quietly, her keen eyes fixed upon Professor Thorne. The modifications required someone with intimate knowledge of acoustic resonance theory, someone with access to precise measuring instruments, someone who understood the very principles that Catherine had coaxed out of your research. The engineer was yourself, Professor, though I suspect you did not know that was what you were assisting in. Thorne's face went pale. That's not possible. I never constructed any modified harmonica. Catherine visited my laboratory, yes, but she never took any instruments away with her. She did not need to, Miss Marple explained. Instead, she obtained your specifications for the resonance patterns, your calculations for the deadly frequencies, perhaps even your drawings and technical notes. With those in hand, she could work with any skilled craftsman, any capable artisan who could follow precise instructions without necessarily understanding their ultimate application. But I would have noticed if documents were missing, Thorne protested weakly. Would you? Miss Marple asked gently. Catherine spent considerable time in your laboratory. She was invited freely, treated with warmth and respect. You were distracted by her charm, by the flattery of her attention. Grunt, by your own desire to share your life's work with someone who seemed to understand and appreciate it. In such circumstances, it would be remarkably easy to photograph documents, to copy specifications, to extract information without the subject even realizing what had been taken. Thorne sank into a chair, the full weight of his complicity becoming apparent to him. I provided the knowledge that enabled her to commit murder. Regardless of my intentions, regardless of Catherine's deception, the fact remains that my research, my life's work, was transformed into a weapon. Yes, Miss Marple said quietly, and that is a burden you will carry, Professor. However, I believe you also bear witness to the dangers of allowing intellectual curiosity to proceed without regard for potential consequences. Your research into the harmful effects of specific frequencies was conducted with purely academic intentions, yet it was vulnerable to appropriation for malevolent purposes precisely because you did not anticipate how such knowledge might be misused. Chapter 6. Collector's Complications. With Catherine Wells in custody and her network of fraud beginning to be dismantled, the investigation took on a different character. The collectors who had purchased instruments from her, believing them to be authentic pieces of historical significance, now had to confront the reality that their acquisitions were elaborate forgeries. Among these collectors was Lord Ashford himself, who revealed that he had purchased 2 instruments from Catherine's collection at considerable expense. The realization that his prized possessions were modern replicas rather than authentic historical pieces seemed to wound him personally, touching upon his identity and his standing within the collector's community. Collectors are peculiar creatures, Miss Marple observed to Inspector Devereux as they discussed the broader implications of the fraud. They identify themselves through their collections. The provenance of an object, its historical authenticity, its connection to great historical figures or important historical events, these elements become woven into the collector's sense of self. When that provenance is revealed to be false, the collector experiences not merely financial loss, but a form of existential betrayal. So you believe that Lord Ashford might have known about the fraud and been complicit in it? The inspector asked. No, I believe the opposite, Miss Marple clarified. Lord Ashford is a man of genuine integrity who was deliberately deceived by someone far more cunning than he imagined. However, his initial anger at discovering the deception has been followed by a curious tendency to minimise the importance of his loss. He has begun to suggest that the replicas possess their own historical significance, that they represent the contemporary craftsperson's art, that they are valuable in their own right despite their lack of authenticity. That seems a rather convenient rationalisation, the inspector observed. It is, Miss Marple agreed, but it is also a very human response to disillusionment. Rather than confront the reality that he was victimised by a clever fraud, Lord Ashford has constructed a narrative in which his loss is recontextualised as an acquisition of different but still valuable objects. It is a defence mechanism, utterly understandable, if ultimately untruthful. The broader investigation into Catherine's fraud network revealed at least 30 collectors across 4 countries who had been duped into purchasing instruments that were clearly identifiable as modern replicas. The total value of the fraud was estimated at nearly £2 million, a sum that represented not merely financial loss, but also damaged reputations and shattered confidence in the authentication processes that collectors relied upon. One particularly striking discovery emerged from the examination of Catherine's records. Among her papers was a detailed analysis of each collector's personal vulnerabilities, psychological weaknesses that Catherine had identified and exploited. For one collector, she emphasised the connection to Benjamin Franklin and American historical prestige. For another, she created elaborate stories about the instrument's previous owners, prominent aristocrats and famous musicians whose names would appeal to the collector's social aspirations. Catherine understood human nature with remarkable clarity, Miss Marple observed. She recognised that people do not make purchasing decisions based purely on rational assessment of objective facts. Instead, people buy stories, identities, connections to history and greatness. Catherine sold precisely those intangible qualities packaged in the form of historical instruments. Chapter 7. No. The second harmonica speaks. As the investigation progressed, attention began to focus more intensely on the second harmonica, the one that had been positioned on stage but never played. Inspector Devereux questioned whether this instrument had any significance to the case beyond serving as a display of Catherine's supposed collection. Miss Marple, however, had continued to ruminate about the second harmonica, sensing that it held significance that had not yet been fully appreciated. She arranged for a final examination of the instrument, this time with particular attention to its physical characteristics and acoustic properties. "Professor Thorne," she said during this examination, "I wonder whether you might examine the glass composition of this harmonica once more. I've been considering the possibility that while Catherine was indeed engaged in fraud, presenting replicas as authentic pieces, there might be another layer of deception entirely. Specifically, I wonder whether this second harmonica might actually be an authentic period piece, purchased at legitimate expense, and whether Catherine's strategy involved presenting one authentic instrument alongside a carefully modified replica." Thorne undertook this examination with fresh attention, now considering the possibility that he might be examining something genuinely ancient. His conclusions, when delivered after careful analysis, surprised everyone present. "Miss Marple is correct," he announced slowly. "This harmonica is indeed authentic. The glass shows characteristic aging patterns consistent with production methods used in the late 18th century. The wooden frame contains timber that has weathered for the appropriate length of time. This is without question a genuine Benjamin Franklin-era glass harmonica." "Then Catherine's scheme was even more calculated than we understood," Inspector Devereux mused. "She paired an expensive authentic piece with a modified replica, using the genuine article to establish credibility while employing the replica to commit her murder." "More than that," Miss Marple said quietly. "Catherine would have intended to sell this authentic harmonica to one collector and the replica to another, or perhaps present both as a match set to her most gullible target. The authentic piece would have served as her proof of legitimacy. Her demonstration of her access to genuine historical instruments. But something prevented her from carrying through with this plan, Professor Thorne observed. Marcus's death, or perhaps her discovery that he might expose the replica before the concert occurred, forced her to act prematurely. Precisely, Miss Marple confirmed. Catherine's carefully orchestrated fraud was threatened by the inconvenient expertise of a talented musician. Rather than lose her entire operation, she escalated to murder, a decision that ultimately led to her exposure and arrest. Chapter 8. The Craftsman in Amsterdam. The investigation gradually expanded to encompass not merely Catherine Wells's activities, but the entire network through which the replica instruments had been created and distributed. Inspector Devereux's colleagues in Scotland Yard coordinated with Dutch law enforcement to locate the craftsman in Amsterdam, who had created the replica harmonicas. The discovery of this individual, a man named Marcus van Hoof, provided crucial corroborating evidence of Catherine's fraud. Van Hoof maintained detailed records of every commission he had undertaken, meticulous documentation that included specifications, materials, pricing, and delivery dates. Among these records were Catherine's requests for multiple instruments, each accompanied by photographs of supposed originals and detailed specifications for exact replication. Crucially, Catherine had also commissioned Van Hoof to conduct the modifications that would render one harmonica lethal. She had provided him with Professor Thorne's calculations, specifications for the necessary acoustic modifications, and precise instructions regarding the frequency patterns to be achieved. However, Van Hoof had been careful to distance himself from the ultimate purpose of these modifications, maintaining that he had been instructed to create acoustic improvements without understanding their potential harmful applications. "It is the old story," Inspector Devereux explained to Miss Marple as they reviewed the evidence. "A skilled craftsman, willing to undertake work that he doesn't entirely understand, for payment that makes difficult questions seem unimportant. Van Hoof almost certainly guessed that the modifications were intended for no legitimate purpose, but he chose not to examine his suspicions too carefully. A common human failing," Miss Marple observed. "The willingness to ignore uncomfortable truths when they conflict with financial advantage. Mr. Van Hoof is not a particularly evil man, I suspect, merely an ordinary one who was willing to compromise his principles for money." The arrest of Van Hoof and his cooperation with authorities further strengthened the case against Catherine Wells. Additional evidence emerged linking her to collectors throughout Europe, victims of her systematic fraud who had never suspected the authenticity of their acquisitions. Chapter 9. The Concert's Aftermath. Months had passed since Marcus Winterby's death, months during which the investigation had slowly and methodically unravelled the full scope of Catherine Wells's criminal activities. Thornbury Hall had returned to its normal rhythms, Lord Ashford having accepted the reality of his victimisation and moved forward with the remainder of his life. Inspector Devereux had closed his active investigation, though the cases against Catherine Wells and Marcus van Hoof remained in the preliminary stages of prosecution. The evidence was overwhelming, the motive abundantly clear, and the mechanism of murder definitively established through the work of Professor Thorne and the detailed analysis of the modified harmonica. Miss Marple found herself reflecting on the case with the kind of melancholic wisdom that comes from long experience with human wrongdoing. She had encountered cases involving fraud before, instances of murder driven by desperation and greed, situations in which intelligence had been perverted to serve criminal purposes. Yet each such case revealed new variations on the eternal themes of human weakness and moral failure. She invited Professor Thorne to take tea once more, a gesture that seemed to surprise him, as though he wondered whether Miss Marple still found his company worth cultivating after his role in enabling Catherine's scheme, however innocent his intentions. "Professor," Miss Marple said once they were settled, "I have been reflecting on the nature of your guilt in this matter. You have clearly experienced considerable distress regarding your complicity, however unintentional, in Marcus Winterby's death. I wonder whether you have considered that such distress, while painful, may also serve a constructive purpose." "I fail to see how guilt over my role in a young man's death could serve any constructive purpose," Thorne replied bitterly. Because guilt that leads to genuine transformation of behaviour and understanding is not merely destructive emotion, Miss Marple explained. Your work on harmonica frequencies was conducted without adequate consideration of how such knowledge might be misused. That failing has been revealed to you with terrible clarity. The question now is whether you will allow that revelation to shape your future conduct with intellectual pursuits. I have already decided that I will no longer pursue research into the harmful potential of musical frequencies, Thorn said quietly. I intend instead to focus my work on the harmonica's aesthetic properties, on its historical significance, on understanding how composers have exploited its unique tonal qualities. A wise decision, Miss Marple said, though perhaps incomplete. I wonder whether you might also consider the broader question of research ethics, or how the pursuit of knowledge might incorporate consideration of potential applications and misuses. Your specialized expertise has value, Professor, but only when coupled with responsibility regarding how that expertise might be appropriated. Chapter 10. The Final Harmonica. A year had passed when Inspector Devereux contacted Miss Marple with a final piece of news regarding the case. Catherine Wells's trial had concluded with a conviction on multiple counts, including murder, fraud, and conspiracy. The sentence was life imprisonment, a fitting conclusion to a criminal career that had spanned nearly a decade and had touched the lives of dozens of victims. More significantly, the police had recovered several additional replica harmonicas from storage facilities that Catherine had maintained in London and Paris. These instruments, destined for sale to collectors who had been carefully selected based on Catherine's psychological profiles, would now be returned to legitimate craftspeople to be destroyed or repurposed, their status as forgeries making them unsuitable for any legitimate collector's market. The authentic Benjamin Franklin harmonica that had been displayed alongside the modified replica was eventually purchased at auction by the British Museum, where it would be preserved as a historically significant piece and made available for research and public education regarding the evolution of musical instruments. Miss Marple was invited to attend a final reception at Thornbury Hall, where Lord Ashford expressed his gratitude for her role in resolving the case and bringing justice for Marcus Winterby's death. The reception included Professor Thorn, who had published a comprehensive academic paper on the history and acoustic properties of the glass harmonica, a work that had received considerable scholarly attention despite, or perhaps because of, the tragic circumstances that had prompted its preparation. "You know," Lord Ashford said to Miss Marple as they observed the assembled guests, "I have been reflecting on what drew Catherine Wells to the fraudulent scheme in the first place. She was clearly a woman of considerable talent, intelligence, and sophistication. She might have built a legitimate career in the art world, in authentication and collection management. Instead, she chose the path of deception and, ultimately, murder. People choose their paths for reasons that often remain opaque even to themselves," Miss Marple replied thoughtfully. Catherine Wells possessed intellectual gifts, certainly, but she appears to have lacked something more fundamental, some capacity for genuine connection with others that goes beyond exploitation and manipulation. Her entire approach to life was transactional, viewing other people not as individuals worthy of respect but as targets, opportunities for fraud. Such a worldview is ultimately isolating and corrosive, leading inexorably toward actions of increasingly desperate violence. "A bleak assessment of human nature," Lord Ashford observed. "Not of human nature generally," Miss Marple clarified, "but of those individuals who have allowed certain destructive aspects of human nature to predominate unchecked. Most people possess capacity for genuine connection, for integrity, for some form of ethical consideration of how their actions affect others. Catherine Wells appears to have systematically suppressed such capacities in herself, until she arrived at a point where murder seemed a reasonable response to a potential threat to her deception. As the reception progressed, Miss Marple found herself drawn once more toward the display of instruments that Thornbury Hall maintained. The modified harmonica, no longer capable of producing its lethal frequencies due to the removal of its etchings during investigation, hung silent beside other, more conventional stringed instruments. Its glass now appeared merely functional, its water-filled bowls now serving no purpose whatsoever. She reflected on the strange duality of objects, how the same physical form could be innocent and deadly depending on the intentions of those who had constructed and employed it. The harmonica itself, whether authentic or replica, was neither good nor evil, merely a vehicle through which human intentions were expressed. The true responsibility lay not with the instrument, but with those who deliberately engineered its transformation into a weapon. The notes of a piano echoed from another room, where a young musician was performing for the assembled guests, music uncomplicated by deception or hidden malice. The simple beauty of genuine artistic expression, unsullied by fraud or hidden agendas, seemed to Miss Marple to represent something fundamentally important that Catherine Wells had lost long before her criminal enterprise had begun. As Miss Marple prepared to depart Thornbury Hall, returning once more to her quiet life in St. Mary Mead, she reflected on the evening's events and the strange journey that had led from a concert's tragic conclusion to the exposure of an elaborate criminal network spanning 3 countries. The glass harmonica's fatal frequency had been silenced, its danger neutralized, its would-be victims protected by the vigilance of investigators and the careful application of knowledge and observation. Yet the broader lesson seemed clear enough, a lesson that Miss Marple had learned through countless cases and interactions, that human beings, with all their gifts and flaws, possessed within themselves the capacity for both extraordinary creativity and devastating cruelty. The question was not whether such darkness existed, but rather how society might encourage the growth of ethical consciousness and moral responsibility among those who possessed power or knowledge that others lacked. That was a question, Miss Marple suspected, that would occupy thoughtful people far into an uncertain future. And so, dear listeners, concludes our tale of the glass harmonica's fatal frequency, a mystery wherein an instrument of ethereal beauty became a vehicle for deception and death, only to be redeemed through careful investigation and the application of knowledge guided by ethical principle. This is Connor, reminding you that at Velvet Clues we celebrate the power of careful observation, logical deduction, and the quiet wisdom of those who refuse to accept the surface appearance of events. Until our next mystery, I wish you all peaceful evenings and minds alert to the strange patterns that human behaviour reveals to those willing to observe carefully enough